Just to let you all know, my name is Gwen Wright. I have been asked to introduce Professor Richard Striner, who's going to be talking about 20 years of historic preservation work in Montgomery County from 1984 to 2004. And I think I was invited because Professor Striner and I actually have a long history. I was actively involved in historic preservation in Montgomery County from 1987 to 2005, moving from being a historic preservation planner to staff for the Historic Preservation Commission to historic preservation supervisor for both planning and parks activities. But like Professor Striner, I've moved on from doing exclusively historic preservation work, and I'm now the Montgomery County Planning Director. Professor Striner is one of a handful of people who really helped make Montgomery County's historic preservation program what it is. Some of the other folks are here today, and you've probably talked with many of them. Eileen McGuckian, Susan Soderberg, and of course I want to recommend the late Mary Ann Kephart, the late Wayne Goldstein. There is really a handful of people who I think contributed to creating a very vibrant and very successful preservation program in the county. Like myself, I've moved on from historic preservation to being planning director. Professor Striner has moved on from doing just historic preservation work and has had an outstanding career in academia. He is a professor at Washington College in Chestertown, and he has written a number of very highly regarded books on different presidents, especially Abraham Lincoln, Woodrow Wilson. He's also written about economics and architecture. But I want to note one of his earliest books that was called Washington Deco, Art Deco in the Nation's Capital, published in 1984. And it was that book that I think influenced me the most. It identified the rich Art Deco architecture in this region, including buildings like the Greyhound bus terminal on New York Avenue, the Hecht Warehouse, and of course the Silver Theater and Shopping Center in Silver Spring. Very few people who visit today the AFI Theater or the downtown Silver Spring, very vibrant sort of commercial area, realize how close we came to losing the Silver Theater and Shopping Center. I'm sure Professor Striner will talk about this, but we had sort of, midnight demolition activities that had to be stopped with an emergency stop work order. And I personally still remember holding the demolition permit for the complex in my hand and basically staring down the attorney for the owner and saying, we just aren't going to process this. Professor Striner was really the key advocate for the Silver Theater and Shopping Center. It really would not be standing today without his efforts. And that is so true of many other important buildings like the ones I mentioned, the Greyhound bus terminal, the Hecht Warehouse, which have been successfully preserved and renovated. They would not be here without the efforts of the gentleman who's going to be talking to us next, Professor Richard Striner.
Thank you, Gwen. Can you all hear me? Oh, good. Yes, it all began for me with the research and writing of that long ago book, Washington Deco, and I co-authored with a Swiss architect named Hans Wirtz, who was studying at GW and loved Art Deco design and took it upon himself to start looking around. And he got a job offer back in Basel that was too good to turn down, so he began looking around for a co-author to finish up the work. And I promise you, I will not stroll down memory lane this way too much. Haven't the time, and you wouldn't be interested anyway. Through a process too long to summarize, he and I crossed paths and decided to be co-authors. Basically, I finished the project, and in the course of doing that, expanded an initial list of buildings that totaled somewhere around 40 to over 400. And the book came out in 1984, but by then, through another series of events that I will not impose upon you by describing, I and others decided to found this regional nonprofit advocacy group, the Art Deco Society of Washington. I'd never done anything like that before, didn't know whether I'd be good at it, didn't know much of anything except that I was doing research on these buildings and I'd seen too many of them bite the dust in the previous dozen or so years, and I wanted to do something about it, but I had a lot to learn. Great deal to learn, particularly because our society was set up to be regional, to deal not only with preservation challenges in Washington, D.C., but in the Maryland and Virginia suburbs as well. Today, I'm going to be talking about one case in particular, the Silver Spring case, which did indeed span 20 years from 1984 to 2004. And I'll be sharing a number of secrets with you. Well, maybe they're secrets. Maybe they're common knowledge in preservation now. What do I know? Because I haven't been involved in preservation for a long time. I have moved on. Some of you may be involved in preservation right now, and some of what I'm going to tell you may or may not be useful to you now, because I'm presuming that things have probably changed a lot. Well, maybe not. But my colleagues and I decided to target our preservation advocacy on buildings that possess two criteria. Buildings that seem to us to be particularly important, and buildings that appear to be under imminent threat, or seem to be likely to come under threat before long. And one of these was the complex at George Avenue and Colesville Road, the Silver Theater and Silver Spring Shopping Center complex. It didn't take much imagination to look at it. Low-rise complex on a key commercial intersection in the heart of the central business district with high-rises going up all around, to foresee its likely fate unless something were done. When we began, we really didn't know how important it was. We had a sense that it was important. How can I share that with you? It looked important. It appeared to us to be a very unusual piece of commercial architecture. Well, it's always nice to have your intuition validated, and within a couple of years, we learned how important it was. My path crossed the path of another consequential person in this story, another academician, Richard Longstreth, professor of architectural history at George Washington University, who was then preservation chair of the Society of Architectural Historians, and it just so happened that he was doing some specialized work in 20th century commercial architecture. And he'd been doing a lot of work out in California, in and around LA. In regard to early motor age architecture, commercial buildings built in response to the automobile. And he had been focusing particularly on drive-in markets, cutting-edge commercial buildings in and around LA that were built to appeal to motorists. And he'd done the first serious work on that, and then he came here to take his faculty appointment at GW and became immediately embroiled in preservation fights of one sort or another. One of those involved a modest-looking complex down in Cleveland Park on Connecticut Avenue, built in 1930. done in the manner of colonial revival, and it was under immediate threat. The owners wanted to demolish it and build something big. It was a little shopping center, originally called the Park and Shop when it was built in 1930. Modest building, built to accommodate tenants with a recessed parking lot to help motorists gain easy access by just pulling right off Connecticut Avenue and gliding right into parking spaces, then gliding right out again. And he took one look at it and he said, now this is very interesting. He said, this is really the first and earliest example of a fusion of two key tendencies in early 20th century commercial architecture. The drive-in access component, which, as I say, he'd been studying so much already, and a shopping center built to accommodate a planned mix of tenants. Those little drive-in markets in LA had been single units, you know, a little grocery store, you can drive in, drive out. Both of these tendencies had been in play separately. Shopping centers built to accommodate a planned mix of tenants could be traced all the way back to the 1870s. Some of you who are familiar with Baltimore may know the Roland Park Shopping Center, one of the earlier ones on the East Coast. But Longstreth said, really, so far as he could tell, this was the first time those two concepts had been fused. So he decided to do a little research in the literature of commercial architecture from the early 1930s, and sure enough, this was recognized immediately as precedent-setting. It got international publicity. And then the decades passed and, you know, events moved along, people got old and died, and, you know, nobody knew in 1983 or 4 that this modest, lowly building had that kind of importance. Of course, you have to be interested in architectural history and social, cultural, other kinds of history to regard that sort of significance as being the sort of thing that should command any respect. Anyway, the fight to save the Park and Shop was successful. It was included in a designated historic district in Cleveland Park. And then Longstreth said, you know, with that prototype, this concept caught on in and around Greater Washington. It just spread like wildfire because during the Great Depression, there were only a few major cities that provided the economic base for vigorous, you know, development because they had the population. And one of the reasons that Washington, D.C. and environs was one of these areas was because of the New Deal workforce. The market was there to plan and build all sorts of cutting-edge buildings, both residential and commercial. Washington became a kind of proving ground for a lot of things of that type. And there were several dozen of these park and shop centers built in and around Washington, and of them all, the complex that interested us at the corner of Georgia and Colesville was the biggest, the most ambitious, etc. The superlatives just kept lining up. Superlatives with regard to the facts about the origin and design of this 1938 complex. It was designed by an architect named John Eberson, who was internationally regarded as the dean of American theater architects. He designed dozens and dozens of cinemas during these years. And this commission was really, really special for him and his firm. They hadn't done anything exactly like this before. Anyway, Eberson had connections with Warner Brothers. He designed a lot of movie theaters for them back in the 1920s in the, you know, silent picture palace days. His theaters were opulent and spectacular. During the Depression, things had to be scaled down a bit. But Eberson was still the big, big name in that field, and he had connections to Warner Brothers because in those days, the major Hollywood studios owned the movie theaters. And of course, their own films would be given preferential booking, but through agreements between the different studios, they would give access to their theaters in return for reciprocity from the others and so on. So Eberson went to Warner Brothers and he said, you know, this commercial complex that's going to get built could generate a major, major development boom. The customers, you know, from the nearby surroundings and from the flow of commuting motorists is really something to be looked at. So, to make a long story short, he succeeded in getting Warner Brothers to go into this project with the developer and make this cinema one of the anchors to the shopping center. It was all built at once in 1938. And when it was dedicated in October of 1938, thousands of people attended. And it did trigger a building boom in Silver Spring. Of course, with World War II, there was a bit of an interruption, but not a complete interruption, because during World War II, Silver Spring was the site for a number of war-related government projects. The automobile showroom was converted to serve as the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. Experiments for advanced weapons were carried out there, and classified briefings were held across the street in the Silver Theater. I've always presumed that the War Department chose Silver Spring because it was located midway between Johns Hopkins, the Homewood campus in Baltimore, and the newly constructed Pentagon. But to serve the workforce at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, a very interesting complex of garden apartments, Montgomery Arms, were built just down the street. So notwithstanding the interruption of the war, development in Silver Spring kept going. And then after World War II, with the construction by the Heck Company of a major branch store at the other end of the square block containing the theater and shopping center complex, and a streamlined J.C. Penney store, the facade of which has been preserved and now welcomes visitors to, what is it, Fillmore, performing arts venue. There were a lot of these buildings, and so going into this in 1984, it seemed to us that if a historic district approach was justified in Cleveland Park, a historic district approach was justified in Silver Spring, a historic district comprising mid-20th century commercial architecture, and when had that ever been done before? Huh. Well, it was an ambitious undertaking because the zoning was a come-on for demolition and high-rise development. Most of the county's planning had been focused on that. The preservation law, Chapter 24A of the Montgomery County Code, had only been passed in 1978. It had only been on the books for a few years. The law had been passed, implementing regulations were put into place. So we decided, all right, let's just talk to some of the movers and shakers who brought about that sequence of events and ask them how we do this. How is the process set up? What should we do? What can we do? And we were told that preservation had been brought under the aegis of broader patterns of land use regulation and zoning in Montgomery County, pre-existing systems of governmental regulation and oversight. We were told that the final decision on any of this has to be made by the elected leaders on the Montgomery County Council. And the County Council had delegated a significant amount of preliminary oversight to the Montgomery County Planning Board, whose members at that time were appointed by the County Council. And Chapter 24A created a new body, the Historic Preservation Commission of Montgomery County. And it was set up to do two things. It was to take the first look at proposed historic resources and assess their claimed historic significance. And if in the judgment of a majority of members of the Historic Preservation Commission, the property in question merited protection, then, and this is how the regulations for Chapter 24A spelled it out, then the Historic Preservation would send its recommendation up to the Planning Board. The Planning Board would then take those recommendations under advisement and then weigh and balance the historic significance, the claimed historic significance, with other issues and factors, to be judged and at times, weighed against each other, against it has to be done when it comes to making approvals to development projects. And if in the judgment of a majority of planning board members after weighing and balancing, perhaps you can tell by my ironic tone that that I've got something up my sleeve with regard to this weighing and balancing business. Well, I do. But this is the way that it was dished out to us. If after weighing and balancing, on balance, they decide that the property should have protection, up goes the recommendation of the county council, and then it weighs and balances and so on. And if they decide to give protection, then the property gets placed on a list called the Montgomery County Master Plan for Historic Preservation. And if a property is added to the master plan, if anyone wants to demolish it, if anyone proposes demolishing it, if anyone proposes significant alterations that could arguably disfigure it, they've got to come to the Historic Preservation Commission, because the commission now, acts as the arbiter as to what can and cannot be done to the property. Is this all reasonably clear? Well, in addition to that, when the law was passed, the county council commissioned planning staff to survey the county and just take a look and see what sorts of properties in their judgment might merit listing on the master plan. And so a list called the Locational Atlas and Index of Historic Sites in Montgomery County, I think that's right, was set up, and the law gave interim protection to buildings on that list so that as they were being evaluated, they couldn't be blown off the face of the earth. We said, all right, well, what can we do to get this process started? And they said, well, it's kind of interesting. When the law was written, outside applicants don't seem to have been envisioned somehow. It was a process that the county itself would take care of. And we said, all right, well then may we respectfully recommend to you that the paperwork we're going to submit be seriously considered as the basis for action. And it was. And a hearing before the Historic Preservation Commission was scheduled for September 1984. And then on Labor Day 1984, the owners of the complex, whose names I will not speak in this room, under cover of darkness, were subjected to a sledgehammer attack. All of the features that seemed to be Art Deco. They found out that we were the instigators, see, so Art Deco, quote unquote, became the target. Any decorative ornamental elements on the buildings that seemed to exude qualities of Art Deco were to be destroyed, and the buildings were to be left stripped. It's possible they were inspired by Donald Trump. Well, in order to construct Trump Tower, he had to destroy a 1929 commercial building called the Bonwit-Teller Building. And there were bas-relief sculptures on the front. And the Metropolitan Museum of Art requested him to delay the demolition just long enough for the panels to be salvaged so that the museum could accession them and put them on display. And Donald Trump agreed, and then suddenly, acting upon some impulse or synapse or glandular secretion, he changed his mind and had the sculpture jackhammered off the building. So, maybe our friends, the owners of the Silver Theater and Shopping Center, were inspired by that kind of leadership. Anyway, what the owners didn't know is that we had found and acquired copies of the as-built blueprints for the whole thing So what had been destroyed could be recreated in a restoration. I would like to say that on this particular occasion, crime did not pay. Was it a crime? Well, the buildings either were or were not on the locational atlas, see. If they were on the locational atlas, they had protection. And what the owners did was in violation of law. But the owners' attorneys began arguing that the buildings were not on the locational atlas. The procedure for adding them to the atlas was unclear, and therefore those provisions were not binding in this case. And as the arguments went on, the sledgehammering went on. And we drew the attention of the media to this, and there was a fair amount of outrage, and sledgehammering just went on. And then a young woman named Avis Black, an attorney who was serving pro bono on the board of the Art Deco Society, called the chairman of the Montgomery County Planning Board, who was also an attorney, the late Norman Christeller, who had a rather problematical reputation among preservationists, but who was a smart, forceful man and did not like the fact that his planning board was being presented with a fait accompli. And Avis Black said, Mr. Christeller, if there's any question about the buildings being on the locational atlas, could the planning board now add them to the locational atlas? Just do that. And according to what Avis Black said to me, Norman Christeller said, huh, or words to that effect. Never thought of that. And so they called a hearing for the purpose of doing just that. And the owners were disputing it all over the place, along with other members of the Silver Spring Chamber of Commerce who saw our proposed historic district now, because this is more than just the theater and shopping center, as a clear and present threat to their development plans. And that was how the war began. It lasted 20 years. And I've already talked a long time. The planning board, under Christeller's leadership, decided that since there was a pending development application for that site, a developer named Joey Kempfer wanted to put up 3 buildings, a hotel and 2 office buildings, and demolish the theater and shopping center. And that project would require planning board approval. That application would be left pending until such time as the planning board and its staff could investigate whether there might be a way to weigh and balance preservation and the benefits thereof with development and the benefits thereof, and find some way to compromise the matter and preserve, well, most of the complex while also permitting development. And it was a fairly large site, and one could put a fairly large tower, at the back. And the Kempfer people didn't like that one bit. But we were able to get some grant money from Maryland Historical Trust to sponsor a study of different ways, using public sector incentives and such, to create the preconditions for such a compromise. And everything seemed to be going along pretty well, until 2 years later, in the election of 1986, a gentleman named Sidney Kramer was elected county executive. And in the election of 1986, Silver Spring development, unless I missed something, had not been mentioned at all. But within 1 month after Mr. Kramer swearing in as county executive, an enormous development proposal for Silver Spring was unveiled. A proposal to build a full-scale regional mall with 2 department store anchors and, if I recall correctly, 5 or 6 office towers on top. A gigantic project. And Mr. Kramer endorsed it immediately. Immediately. We've been making some inroads in Montgomery County politics. Our initiative had caught the interest of some nearby civic groups in and around Silver Spring, whose leaders were somewhat, tickled by the fact that an important Art Deco resource was present in the heart of the Silver Spring Business District, and we'd been building a pretty handy amount of support, but all that vanished once the proposals for this regional mall were unveiled because the 2 department store anchors dazzled enough people in Silver Spring, which at that point was fairly run down. Macy's and Nordstrom, especially Nordstrom, and the appeal of imminent glitz and swank in downtown Silver Spring was simply too much for us to combat. Our support in the civic associations plummeted. Every time we tried to make the scholarly case for the significance of the buildings, we were drowned out in a chorus of catcalls along the lines of, "I can't see what's so great about it." Now, that in itself is an interesting commentary on the cultural history of historic preservation. They couldn't see what was so great about it. Historic preservation as a movement has a history too, and it's a very interesting and ironic history. A long time ago, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, historic preservation was driven by concerns about history with a capital H, history on the grand scale. And the challenge for many preservationists was to make the case for saving a building if George Washington didn't sleep there. That was the, that was the slogan. And in those circumstances, it was a powerful thing when the American Institute of Architects began to make the case that buildings could have historic significance even if George Washington didn't sleep there, even if a treaty hadn't been signed there. Architecture and design has a history too. And if this building is important to the history of architecture, that should be enough. And in its day, that was a liberating and empowering point to make. Well, yesterday's liberation can become tomorrow's tyranny. And by the 1980s, historians were playing so small a role in the preservation movement, and architects were playing so great a role that the complaint that people couldn't see what was so great about it was deadly. It was all a matter of design, whether you like it, whether it's big, fancy, a masterwork in artistic terms. If not, blow it off the face of the earth. That was the unstated set of presumptions we had to combat. And we tried and failed. Nobody would listen. Well, a few people listened, but not very many. We were going down in flames. And so we initiated simultaneous strategic action in 2 directions to try to salvage the situation if we could. One of them was to take ourselves out of the spotlight and out of the line of fire, and to refocus the attention of the public. Well, not refocus it on the development project. They were focused on that development project, all right, but focused on its on its positive allure. We decided to see whether we could get them to look at the underside of that project, the dark side of that project, if you will. Because you're not going to cram an enormous complex like that into the congested heart of a central business district with residential neighborhoods surrounding it without having some sort of negative impact. I'm talking traffic. So we did a little research in the trade literature and found that generally a regional mall of that size will, this is in those days now, would tend to bring in on a daily basis about, 30,000 car trips. I think that's right. And that's just on normal days, not on weekends or holidays or anything like that. So, we decided to use a little psychology on the developer and his followers. When we went to civic association meetings, instead of trying to make the impossible case for our buildings. We just played that cool and said something different. We said, well, you all know that we believe these buildings have importance, and many of you have made up your minds about that, and we're not going to argue with you. Probably we're not going to change your minds, and you're not going to change ours. Our detractors often say that we don't live here, and those who live here should have the preeminent right to say what should happen. I still remember some of those Richard Striner go-home letters to the editor of the Montgomery Journal. I should dig one out and get it framed. Maybe I will. But I said, you know, I don't live here. That's right. You do. But if I did live here, I'd at least ask this man a few questions. Like, you know, if you get Macy's and Nordstrom, what else are you going to get, huh? You might get some things you might wind up disliking. It's possible. Like traffic gridlock. I mean, it's possible. We did a little bit of checking, and we found in the trade literature that a commercial complex of this size will typically generate, and then you could almost hear the intake of breath, you know, in the audience. Never thought of that. And then I said, can I prove that will happen in this case? Well, no, of course I can't prove that would happen in this case. But I'm not the one to ask. Ask him. Ask him. He must have a pretty clear idea of the entire morphology of this development project, because he wouldn't have pro formas he could take to lenders, you know, if he didn't. Ask him. That was all it took. We didn't have to get excited. We didn't have to call names, didn't have to do anything except ask them to ask him. And this enormous grassroots rebellion erupted. And the Kramer administration became increasingly defiant, you know, toward any who questioned the merits of this project. And when that happened, civic activists all over the county who were concerned about overdevelopment and traffic started saying, if a county executive can force this kind of thing into a jurisdiction that is not an organized city or town, that does not have a mayor and city council, that is at the mercy of Rockville, maybe this is a test to see what can be done all over the county. Why not? Well, to make a long story short, this rebellion got Sidney Kramer thrown out of office by the voters at the end of that one term. But while this was going on, we had to brace ourselves for an imminent demolition threat. Because Sidney Kramer, when he'd been a member of the General Assembly, helped to put through some legislation amending the county charter of Montgomery County, changing the way in which the planning board is constituted. When we got into this, all the members of the planning board were appointed by the county council. Not anymore. Now the county executive would get to appoint, I forget how many, but several. And then Sidney Kramer stepped right into the role of county executive and wielded the power he had just given to himself, and began packing the planning board with, you know, people who made it quite clear they intended to approve this project and, you know, make it possible to issue demolition permits. And so, while all this was going on, we were desperately seeking lawyers. Some people in our allied civic organizations who opposed the development project, not because of preservation concerns, but because of traffic concerns, had already succeeded in getting pro bono representation from one of the biggest and most powerful law firms in the nation's capital, Arnold and Porter. So we began trying to do the same thing, and we succeeded in gaining pro bono representation from a big national law firm, Skadden Arps. Yeah, funny names. And then something very interesting happened, and this is one of the secrets I'm going to share with you, but it might not be relevant anymore for all kinds of reasons I wouldn't know about. They asked us about Chapter 24A. how the law was written, what its regulations stipulated, the multi-level review process, HPC to Planning Board to County Council, Historic Preservation Commission assessment of the significance, weighing and balancing by the Planning Board, weighing and balancing by the County Council, and we said, that's the way it is. They said, it is, we'll see. We're going to look at the state enabling legislation that stands behind this county land use regulatory authority, because under law, land use regulation authority is lodged at the state level, except in extraordinary cases when the federal government may acquire, a property through eminent domain, something like that. But generally, land use regulatory authority resides at the state level. And if smaller jurisdictions within that state are to have land use regulatory power, the state legislature must make provision for that in state enabling legislation. So they looked at the state enabling legislation that stood behind Chapter 24A, and then they looked at the regs for Chapter 24A, and they laughed. They said, whoever wrote those regulations, whoever it was in the county attorney's office, must have been joking. There is no legal basis behind these regulations at all. There is no basis under law for the planning board to weigh and balance anything, or the county council. According to state enabling legislation, protection for historic properties in this county must be based upon an assessment of their significance. And that is it. That's what the law says. So what we're going to do is to let them go ahead and do their weighing and balancing, see? And then when they get ready to issue the project plan approval and issue the demolition permit, then we go to court with an injunction saying the entire legal basis for these proceedings has been totally insubstantial. None of this is valid. The county's going to have to start all over again. And here's why. But in the meantime, they said, let's just do a little further research into the criteria that must be used by the HPC, Planning Board, and Council. Well, the law itself didn't say. So they said, let's go to the agency that serves as Maryland's Historic Preservation Agency, Maryland Historical Trust. And they asked the people at Maryland Historical Trust, in your surveys of historic properties around the state, what criteria do you use to evaluate them? And the people said, oh, we use National Register criteria. You all know about the National Register of Historic Places. Doesn't directly protect anything, but it can have its value. In this case, it had its value. The attorney said, we are going to do an expedited nomination to the National Register for the theater and shopping center complex. A Reagan-era change to the law made it possible for the owners of a property to object to its being listed in the National Register, but you could still get a determination of eligibility from the National Register program, which is in the National Park Service, Department of the Interior. And the process for a National Register application, in this case, would be to start with the HPC, which was doing double duty as Montgomery County's preliminary evaluator of National Register nominations. Then it would go to Maryland Historical Trust, which has a committee, the Governor's Consulting Committee on the National Register, and then they assess the criteria, and then it goes to the Park Service. And thus began a protracted fight to get a determination of eligibility for the National Register. Surely you see why. Our secret strategy was to get the theater and shopping center complex determined eligible for the National Register. Eligible, why? Because it met the criteria. The same criteria used by Maryland's State Preservation Planning Agency. And if any criteria are to be used by these local entities, what other criteria should be used except for those used by Maryland's own State Preservation Agency? This was the case we were going to make. Well, we never had to make it. We never had to use this secret weapon that we'd prepared. but in some way sensing that this National Register nomination was not a good thing for this development project, we were told that County Executive Kramer told the preservation staff member who would be working with the HPC on this National Register nomination that if she processed the paperwork, she would be fired. She processed the paperwork, and she was fired. Hardball. Sledgehammer tactics. Well, we got it declared eligible. But as I say, we never had to use this secret weapon. But it was fun to threaten, because the lawsuits by our allied civic groups on the traffic issue did get court judgments that forced the planning board to start all over again. And so all we had to do was to allude to the fact that we too had the capability of delivering lawsuits, and that was enough to start to give us some leverage, at the bargaining table with this developer. And as soon as Sidney Kramer was thrown out of office in 1990, negotiations began. Let me see. 15 minutes? I'll make this fast. Surely victory was at hand? No. No, it wasn't. The elected leader who replaced Sidney Kramer was an extremely idealistic, altruistic veteran of county council service, Neil Potter. And we hoped that he would fix things so that preservation could be achieved with, an appropriate amount of development. And County Executive Potter continued to act as though he were a member of the county council, not county executive. Leadership, was not forthcoming, and we began to get very, very nervous about that. Anyway, it took another county executive, Doug Duncan, to put things together. A civic activist who worked for Neil Potter for a while came up with an audacious and brilliant way for the Montgomery County government to give itself the power to call the shots with regard to development on this site. Call the shots in a proactive way instead of merely reacting to development proposals. Since the theater and shopping center were in blighted condition, made to look blighted, it was poetic justice for Montgomery County to use the process of condemnation under the aegis of urban renewal to gain possession of the theater and shopping center through eminent domain. The owners were paid, but there was no question about the sale. They were selling all right. Montgomery County now owned the properties, and being the owner of the theater and shopping center, Montgomery County could issue requests for proposals from developers all over the country to, suggest appropriate projects for that site. Silver Spring had to go through one more mega mall proposal. A family company that developed immense malls like, I forget the name of it. It's on the outskirts of Minneapolis. Yeah, Mall of America. They were going to put in a mall even bigger than the one that Lloyd Moore, the first developer, had proposed. Oh yes, the developer Lloyd Moore. A little problem. He had some financial interest in this, and unless the county could in some way address his financial interests, he could claim injury, in many sorts of ways, in a manner that could tie the process up for Lord knows how many decades. And so essentially Montgomery County just bought him out, paid him to go away. Power politics, see. Anyway, when massive civic opposition to the second mega mall project, along with some doubts on the part of County Executive Duncan as to the developer's ability to perform, that developer was told to hit the road, and the current package was put in place. A development company named Folger Pratt was given the opportunity to do the commercial development, preserving most of the shopping center. An American Film Institute was recruited to be a long-term tenant in the Silver Theater. I don't know what their rent is according to their lease. Rumor had it they were paying $1 a year on a lease of 100 years. I don't know if that's true. Seems appropriate, though. AFI got a great deal, an East Coast headquarters in a really interesting 1938 cinema, and Montgomery County found a reliable, prestigious operator to keep the theater in use. And in 2004, the ribbon cutting for the Silver Theater took place. As I say, 20 years, 1984 to 2004. What all or any of this might be worth to you now in Montgomery preservation is not a subject I could even guess at. Maybe none of it is directly useful. Maybe the findings and theories of our pro bono attorneys with regard to Montgomery County's, preservation regulations contrasted to the provisions of state enabling legislation might be useful or might not. For all I know, the regs have been changed. I don't know. But some principles, some lessons to be gleaned from this story are, I think, perennially useful to preservationists. It is, in my view, terribly important for historic preservationists to stay on theme and put history first. I've never met a preservationist who struggled to save a building they hate. That's just the reality of human nature. But taste is subjective. And if we like it enough to try to save it, great. But taste alone, aesthetics alone, architectural design alone, unless in ornamental terms the building, in that particular way attained a certain kind of significance within the history of architecture per se. You see what I'm saying? But unless that's the case, take the broadest possible look at the property. Doesn't matter whether George Washington slept there, doesn't matter whether it's an artistic masterwork, doesn't matter whether the hoi polloi happened to like it or not. If you can demonstrate that it has importance, that it can teach important things about how we came to be the way we are, it has importance that will outlast us, and that's the kind of importance that justifies protection. Stay on theme that way. But as you do so, be mindful of the fact that that kind of scholarly case for preservation will not get you anywhere if you are up against massive political, economic, and cultural counterforce that has got to be confronted in terms of Machtpolitik. You have got to find ways of generating countervailing power of some kind, and it's got to be legal. You have got to identify and summon and channel power of some kind. Channel it strategically so as to hold off that demolition threat, break up the existing configuration of power politics, and having broken up that configuration, meld it into new configurations that you will then guide over the horizon toward the destination you want, if you can. That's strategic thinking. And this, for what it's worth, is what led me to the serious study of Abraham Lincoln. A moral strategist par excellence. A man who had a fervent idealistic mission to perform, but was at one and the same time one of the most street-smart Machiavellian power orchestrators to come along. One thing does lead to another. That's my story for what it's worth, and I'd be very happy to take questions if you have them. Thank you for your patience. Oh, yes, my publishers want me to hawk this. The second book that I've co-authored on Art Deco, not just in Greater Washington, but in Baltimore as well. Johns Hopkins published it 3 years ago. My co-author, a wonderful architectural historian in Baltimore named Melissa Blair. We had a fabulous time writing the book together. She covered Baltimore. And I'll leave it right here if any of you would like to look it over.